Alright, so what is Maya the Bee Sweet Gold? Well, it's a video game. It's a platformer based on a book series that had some pretty heavy political themes. But that's not what Maya the Bee Sweet Gold is. No, Maya the Bee the video game is a platformer. And at first glimpse, it probably seems like a fairly standard platformer. You can jump and you can float with your little bee wings, and that's really all you can do. But that doesn't mean that Maya the Bee has to be substandard or uninspired. The developers looked at the jumping and floating and said, okay, what can we do with just these two mechanics? And the first thing they came up with, I think is fairly obvious, is using enemies to get higher, using enemies as platforms. And you can jump on enemies successively, which means some of the stages are going to be huge lines of enemies for you to bounce on and get up higher. But what's to stop you from using the wings all the time? Because they can become kind of a crutch, you know? Well, there is a little honeypot down there in the corner. You need to conserve your wing use, because you only get wing power back from these little flowers spread throughout the stage. And the later stages are very, very vertical, and you have to look around and think, okay, how can I get higher? What can I use in my current surroundings to get higher? And instead of just, what can I use to get from left to right? The game gets more and more vertical, and you have to get more and more creative with your wing use, your jumping, and you have to be very careful about how much you use your little flutter. This doesn't mean that the game ever gets unforgiving or anything, but they do keep introducing new ways to use just basic jumping mechanics throughout the entire game, and it never really gets boring. The first stage here is very simple, but it introduces you to ideas you're going to see throughout the rest of the game, like those little wobbly platforms and all these different types of enemies and the way you can confront them. You might not realize it at the time what the game is trying to do for you, but if you do, it's very helpful because it's the least noticeable tutorial stage possible. Now, something else the game does is change the world as you play. This place, the Meadow, it introduces new types of enemies and new ways to interact with the environment and new ways to platform, but it's pretty standard otherwise. Now, the game would be perfectly fine if it kept heading in its initial direction, kept introducing new enemies, new ways to get higher, and, tighter jumps for you to make, and more conservation of your little honey meter right there. But that's not all it does. It uses theming. So suddenly, it starts raining. And instead of this just being a cosmetic difference, the rain makes things slipperier. And this, combined with those little wobbly wooden platforms you saw earlier, means you have to absolutely stick your jumps. Now, this might seem a little bit harsh, but it's preparing you for things later in the game, where you can't adjust yourself after you land on the platform because the jumps are tighter and more difficult. You have to be very sure of where you're jumping, and this game teaches you how to do that using the environment, using what little atmosphere it has, and using its theming. It teaches you about game mechanics upcoming in the most fluid way possible. And after that, after the sun comes out and things are dried up, there are still little puddles left over, as you're seeing right here, and that adds even more new game mechanics. It helps you learn about bouncing on enemies to get from place to place, which will become very, very important in later stages. And again, it teaches you how to stick your jumps, using the water as a deterrent to just, failing. So as the worlds change cosmetically from stage to stage, they also introduce new ways to use what little game mechanics you have, slowly building you up more and more, teaching you more as you play. Like this little anthill area right here, it teaches you how to make tight jumps, how to squeeze in between enemies in tiny tight spaces, and it also introduces the more labyrinthine aspects of the platforming that come in during the stages after this, and will be a part of the game until it's over. It slowly builds on itself with each world, and as the world changes, so does the game, and it's really fascinating in that aspect, and that's just good game design. So don't let the apparent simplicity fool you into not trying this out, because it's a perfect example of what I was talking about with theming and platforming. It uses the themes of the world, and it uses its very basic mechanics to turn it into something it would not be otherwise, and that's just fantastic.